Hello and welcome to CS230. This is lecture 6 and this is lesson 4. And in this lesson we're going to be looking at JavaScript timer events, and we're going to look specifically at timers and interval timers, and I guess we're also going to have a little bit looking at events, just events themselves. We've seen some already, but we're going to create and use timers with JavaScript, and I'm going to be returning to that earlier example that I had in one of the bonus lessons that I gave for week 3, using the triangle. And essentially I'm going to create a nice triangle containing some text in the middle, and we're going to look at rotating it in a clockwise direction using a start and stop button, and everything will be controlled by events and timers. So let's first of all have a quick review of events. So we saw how to create events at one point in an earlier lesson, and we created an element using HTML, and we also did one with JavaScript, and we can add an event handler both ways. So the latter way, where we create an element and then dynamically, and then we add an event to it, and we use a method called the add event listener. What it does is it sets up a function. Sometimes it's an anonymous function that would be called whenever the specified event is delivered to the target. So you might have an element, you could have the document itself, you could have a window, and the target be any object at all that supports events. And we're going to see another one later in some lectures called the XML HTTP request object that supports events too, and we'll have a look at that a little bit later. Anyway, we're really just interested in adding an event listener. And in doing that, we need two things. We need to be able to say, well, what are we listening for, and what do we do when that event happens? So it adds a function or some object that implements event listener to the list of event listeners for the specified event type on the event target on which it's called. And that's really specific, but it's best to have a look at an example. And I'd recommend looking at the Mozilla Developer Network documents on add event listener. It's pretty good. Go into much more detail than I'm doing here. Okay, so when we create a simple event handler, we do it like this. So this is a table, a very simple table. It's just a very simple table in your page. It has one column called number, and it has a cell called T1 and a cell called T2. It also has a little header called number, just so we know what it is. What we're interested in doing is creating an event that whenever we click the table, it updates cell 2. Okay, and let's have a quick look at that, because obviously I made it earlier. So we click the table, and every time we click the table, we can see it's changing the number. Okay, so that's what we're trying to event. So the table, when we create it, doesn't have an event handler. We don't have an on-click attribute here. We just have the name of the ID. So what do we do? Okay, so first of all, we created a little function that's called and tells us what to do when we're clicked. So that's our event handler function. So we're just creating a reference to the element, which is cell 2, and we're telling it that the first cell for this particular row, if it has a number that's greater than 0, let's just increase that value. So that's why we were able to increment it. Then we add a listener to the event. And the way we do that is we get a reference to the table this time. The table was called outside. Look up here, it's outside. And then we just add an event listener when we get a click. You notice that is not an on-click. Okay, we're just adding a click handler here. We use the on-click if we were to actually add an attribute to the table itself. And we're giving the name of the function, which is modify text, and false. Okay, so we can look at the specifications to see why that's false. Okay, a little bit later. Okay, and that's what's happening. So every time we click, we get our increase to our table. Entry, click, 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 and we can see it's changing. Okay, we can reload that. Okay, so that's adding an event handler to the cell. Now let's go into that a little bit more detail. Okay, we can also add an anonymous function. Okay, so this time when we create the event, okay, so this time I'm interested in clicking cell 1. So we click T1. Okay, we do that, and this time we're actually going to set it to the value. And what's happening is we're going to pass a value to be set to the cell 1 when we click it. Okay, and so what I'm going to do is I'm creating this anonymous function this time. Instead of calling the method like we did last time up here, modify text, this time I'm actually calling an anonymous function. And as part of that, it function body, it just resets the cell value to 4. So I can pass a parameter, and that's what I've done on my example. I'm going to reload this. So instead of clicking the cell, I'm going to click. I'm clicking the cell and I'm clicking the table. Okay, so we got that went to 4. So two things are happening simultaneously. Two events are happening simultaneously here. Okay, and the full code for that, of course, is available here. Okay, so here's the table. You'll notice that because I've created a table, okay, I've put my functions up here in my script tag in the head section, but once I've created a table here in the body section, then I add a script tag afterwards to add those event handlers, okay? I can't put the event handlers up here because this section is processed before the body's loaded, and so this element, this line will give us an error because it's trying to find an element that doesn't yet exist. So that's why we do it this way, okay? Right, so that's quite nice. And just before we move on to our other timers, let's have a quick look. Okay, let's have a quick look at something else. Yeah, we can go back. We can set up the fat arrow function here as well to do it this way if we want it. I'm just doing this because we've done it in the last lesson. Okay, right. So the next thing we're interested in are timers. So what we're interested in doing with timers is we have 4 functions that methods we need to look at. We set an interval. Set interval, that allows you to be able to specify a function that's executed or some code snippet with a fixed time delay between the call. Okay, it returns an interval ID, and then we use that to specify how to delete it a little bit later when we use clear interval. Okay, there's a set timeout, and the set timeout method that sets a timer and that executes a function or a piece of code once the timer expires. And then we can use clear timeout. So there's just these 4 methods to set up timers. And I'm going to show you a little example that I've done with my triangles. Okay, so it's this one here. Okay, so here's my triangle. You'll notice I have my triangle with the center text, have an on-off button, and I've got some nice some hovers here, and that's specified as part of the actual hover. Let's look at the code for this. Normal triangle stuff that's there. I set up my triangle. I set up, I'm just centering a button. I'm giving it what happens when I click. I've created a function that turns the rotation on and off. Okay, and I have a class called toggle, and actually I've put the toggle, if you notice it changes color when I hover here. All that's handled by the toggle hover. There's no event handler for that, apart from the one that's built into the CSS. So another kind of doing events. I'm updating my little log again. Okay, so I have a rotation method here. If rotating is set, and rotate is just a variable that I've set here to be false. So initially it's not rotating, and so I start rotating. So if it's true, okay, then if it's false, not rotating, I start rotating. I update my log, which is my little log over here. And then I start, and start sets the timer. And of course, the opposite is true, when the other way around, okay? So start then takes the triangle, finds out where the triangle is, and sets up this interval timer. And I'm assigning it to a value called runner, which is our value. It has an anonymous function. And what it does is it increases degrees. So initially, the degrees, it's centered, so 0 degrees. So we increase the degrees. And then we just transform the circle using the transform style to rotate by those number of degrees. And that's it. Stop clears the timer. Runner is just the variable that I'm using to hold the timer. I'm using runner because you sometimes see that. Let's start. Okay, and I'm having the log here. Okay, so I'm rotating my triangle. It looks nice. I can stop it. I can start it. I can stop it. Start it. One thing I could do actually, which I haven't thought about, is I could actually, this button here, I could actually have changed that value of on to off when that button is clicked. I could set that up as well, but maybe you might like to try that yourself. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward. Rotate on and off is just a method that I click. It's a toggle switch. Okay, I'm using a timer to set up a function that repeatedly calls this piece of code here, okay, every 50 milliseconds, okay, And the code, all that code does is updates the angle that I currently have, and I'm using CSS transforms in order to rotate the actual item itself, the container, so I don't have to do anything complex. It's all handled by the CSS. Okay, so it's not too difficult. If you get a hang of this, you should be able to do most things that you like to do. So, very simple, basic event timers. We have to delve into it in much more depth if we want to understand the order of events, for example, that click where we had the click in the cell and the click in the table. So if you look at the Mozilla Developer Network reference, the one that I showed earlier in the document up here, then that will actually show you lots and lots of examples of how to do that. So you can see the code and you can practice and click. There's a lot to know about getting data in and out of elements, and we need to fix that as well and understand that as well. So, and again, we just saw a very simple use of how to use timers and timeouts. Okay, thank you very much for watching.